Hello. Don't knock yourselves out. Thank you. Well, my name's James O'Loughlin. Welcome to the Festival of Dangerous Ideas and this session on abolishing private schools, presented in partnership with the Sydney Morning Herald. These people on my right are part of our panel. I'll introduce them in due course. But before that, I want to ask you this. Are you feeling nervous? Are you a little bit scared? Well, you should be, because this is the festival of not happy, easy ideas, but of dangerous ideas. And it is all about being exposed to new ideas that might frighten you, that might agitate you, that might make you angry, that might make you excited. There's all sorts of things that could happen that will make this experience far more dangerous for you and hopefully provocative than watching 2.5 Men, Game of Thrones, or even, dare I say it, Q&A. I asked what the audience was like. Who are the audience, I said, and the answer is obvious. They're people who couldn't give a stuff about AFL. Welcome. I couldn't give a stuff either. We are united in that. Except for one guy in the 15th row who I just saw going, thanks a lot to my wife. A warning, some of the ideas and opinions that will be expressed on this stage may cause you to feel all sorts of things. They may cause you to think. They may cause you to question ideas that you have had for so long you didn't even know they were ideas. You just thought they were the status quo. So I hope you're ready. In my 46.5 years on this planet, I can't remember ever asking myself the question, what if there were no private schools? Because private schools have been such an established part of the landscape that they seem beyond question inevitable, in the same way that traffic jams on Friday afternoons are inevitable in the same way that always having to wait for the doctor when you go there are inevitable. But today we ask, what would happen if private schools were abolished and replaced by adequately funded government schools? Who would win, who would lose, and how would our society be different? And ultimately, would it be a better one or a worse one? We have, as I said, we have a panel of education experts ready to debate, argue, even with a bit of luck, fight and throw water over each other. I will introduce them soon, but first, let's go to Finland. Why Finland? Well, because in Finland there are no schools where parents pay fees. All schools are funded by the government, and they don't have a rigid, centrally set, standardised curriculum with lots of standardised tests. The kids don't even get much homework. But what they do have in Finland are consistently excellent educational results. How do they do it? Well, for the first 20 minutes of this session, you're going to find out a bit more about the Finnish educational system from Pasi Sahlberg. He was an advisor to the Finnish education ministry during the 1990s when lots of changes were made. And I should say that about 30 years ago, none of that was the case in Finland. They didn't have great educational outcomes, and their educational system didn't look that different from many others. So it's all happened fairly recently. Pasi's now Director General of the Centre for International Mobility and Cooperation in Finland. He's a globally renowned expert in educational reform and teaching, and he's just published Finnish Lessons, What Can the World Learn About Educational Change in Finland? Well, he's going to tell us that for the first bit of this session, then we'll throw it open to the panel. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, all the way from Finland, and I've never ever said that before in my entire media career, Pasi Sahlberg. Make him very welcome.
Good day. You know, the most difficult thing for many people is to decide how to begin the talk. And you know, Americans, they tell a joke, and the Asians, they apologize. And I apologize, it's a bad joke. And I understand that this is a game day here. That's why I would like to start my presentation, this little talk here, with an exercise where I want all of you to take part. And the purpose of this little exercise is to show you how simple things are not always so simple, like reforming education system, for example. And the only thing you need to do is to use your primary school mathematics, okay? So I'll ask you all to take part, including my panel here, to this little exercise. It will not take more than 30 seconds, all right? And it's a very easy thing to do. The only thing you have to do is to call out the number that you will see on the screen as loud as you can, okay? And if it helps, consider yourself now in Melbourne, in a Melbourne cricket crowd, supporting one of the birds, all right? So the only thing you need to do is to call out the number that you will see, and when you see the new number coming, just add that number to the previous one, okay, and call that sum, all right? Are you with me? The panel, are you with me? All right, so let's try. And we are probably about 1,000 people here, so I want to have some noise, all right? So we can compete with Melbourne here. Are you ready? Okay, 1, 2, 3.
1,000. 40. 2,040.
You know what? You can do much better than this, yeah? Let's try again, okay? Are you ready? And now loud. Remember, your team is losing. All right, let's go now. 1, 2, 3.
1,040. 2,040. 2,070. 3,070. 3,090. 4,090. 5,000.
What's wrong?
All right.
Did you say 5,000? I did.
All right, and this is a question now. How many of you were good in primary mathematics? Okay, but just think about this for a moment. You know, if we make a mistake with a simple arithmetics like this, we are probably making mistakes with much more complicated things, like this afternoon we are talking about education here. But let me start by asking the question of Finland. How many of you are Finns here? How many of you would like to be a Finn? Right. You know, when I ask this in education conferences, people tell me that there are two types of people on the planet. There are Finns and wannabe Finns. Yeah? But it's kind of a new thing, like you heard in the introduction, that this is we have not always been like this. But when I travel around the world, and I have had this privilege now for several years, and I literally go on all the continents and meet people like you, and teachers and educators and students as well, I often ask a question that when you close your eyes and you think about Finland, what do you see? Tell me. Snow and ice. Yeah. Okay. So we are all educated people here, so we have some ideas, you have seen some things before. But if you imagine folks, audience who have not any experience of my country, you know, this is the first image that almost everybody has, that it's always ice and cold and snowy and dark in Finland. There are many people who believe that it's always like this, 12 months a year, 24 hours a day, yeah? And then there are those who come to me and say that now I understand why Finnish pupils are doing so well in these international studies, because it's always like this. You know, there's nothing else to do. You cannot go out and play football or cricket or whatever you do. You have to go to school, do your work there, and come home and do your homework, yeah, all year round. This is another image that many people have about Finns, yeah? So you can use your imagination to think which story this is telling. But many people tell me that the Finns they know are not very talkative, that they only talk when there's something necessary to say. And Finns are very bad in small talk, you see? And this is true, you know. The Finnish man is at his best when he's in a forest with the nature, and there's no other people around, yeah? And there's this little anecdote about, related to this. There was a Finnish couple who had been married for at least 25 years, and one day the wife came to her husband and said that, honey, why don't you ever talk to me like I see American, Australian, English men speaking to their wives, things like, you know, I love you and you're so beautiful and all these things. And this Finnish man was really surprised about this and said that, So remember 25 years ago when we got married? And she said, of course I remember this. And on our wedding day, I told you that I love you. And she said, how can I forget this one? And then the Finnish man said that, if I change my mind, I'll let you know. And then there are those who associate Finland somehow to Santa Claus. And there are some people who think that all the Finnish people are like this, Santa Clauses, because there are 7 billion people on the planet, and everybody knows that Santa Claus is from Finland. So if there's enough Santa Clauses to cover the whole world, there has to be like 6 million Santa Clauses in Finland. So we are all people like this. So what is the purpose of all these images and pictures? You know, if people think about Finland through these types of ideas, it becomes very difficult to understand that how Finland is on the headlines of the media and news all around the world. Okay? And let me make one thing clear here. I'm not going to argue here that Finland has the best education system in the world, because I don't think so. But I think we have been able to create and build a public education system that most parents, most taxpayers are happy with. Our school system at the moment has about 85% confidence level among Finnish taxpayers. So there are very few people who think that the education system is not doing a good job. And I think that this must be a world record. Okay? If you look at this, how the system has evolved, and here I would like to make a point that Finland is one of the few countries in the developing part of the world, among the OECD countries, that has experienced a kind of a continuous progress since the early 1970s until now. There are not too many other countries who have had this type of experience, and the importance of this image is to try to show you how we have really climbed from behind of almost everybody in the world to be not on the top of the world, but one of the good education, high-performing education systems in the world. So this is how the history has looked like. And this is important because sometimes people say that maybe Finland as a small country, few million people, rather homogeneous, unlike Australia, and there's always ice and snow and cold and dark, has always been a good country in education, and there has not been progress. But this image and the data in my book shows that this is not really the case, that we are one of those continuous, steady improvers in education. I was in Melbourne last week and listening to the presentations from the authorities from the federal government and from the states, and many people seem to argue that here in Australia and in New Zealand the direction has been the opposite. Not very much, but still in a wrong way. So I think this raises the question that what Finland has been doing, what are the things that have made Finland a system that everybody is looking so closely at. So let me look at two things here. The other one is equality and the other one is equity. These are two concepts that are very closely related. And one of the interesting questions that many people ask is that, is there any relationship between the income inequality in the countries? In other words, how equal or unequal the countries are, and how well students are learning in these countries? It's a fair question, all right? So I have this little graph for you where this little white dot in the middle represents the average. So this is the average income inequality in the wealthy countries. And in the vertical line, you will see that this is the average educational performance as measured by the international studies, like the OECD PISA, for example. Now, where do you think Australia lies here? Where is Australia in this map? Australia is somewhere there. So you have a fairly large inequality in terms of income, and you have an education system that is performing fairly well compared to many other countries in terms of reading, mathematics, and science, okay? Where do you think Finland is here? Are we similar or different? Okay? You are pointing to the right direction. Finland is over there, all right? So we have a very small, one of the smallest income inequalities, income differences in the world, and we have fairly high educational performance. So let me give you some other countries so that you can see how some of the wealthy countries are locating here in the map. And there seems to be a kind of a small negative correlation between inequality and outcome. So the conclusion from this picture is that the more inequality the more unequal your country, your education system is, or your nation, your society is, more difficult it becomes to create good educational outcomes. So in other words, we need to also care about the inequality if we want to take the educational improvement seriously. Now, let's look at the other concept, equity, that is a kind of a topic of my talk here. Now, most often when we are in a business of improving education systems, we are looking at excellence or quality of education system. In other words, how well our students are learning when we are measuring, using the measurements like the OECD PISA or your national assessment systems like NAPLAN, all right? So this is the thing. Most people are thinking about educational improvement only using the one-dimensional axis here. So we all know that the OECD, this represents the OECD average, is measuring and comparing different countries, including Australia, in a regular way, using the math, reading, and science as a criteria. So these are the countries. This is kind of a rough estimate of how the countries are doing if we only look at the excellence. In other words, the educational performance that is measured by these tests. So you will find Australia, New Zealand, and some other countries. They are not all the OECD countries here, but you will see how they all come into this one line from poor educational performance to high educational performance. But very few people actually pay attention to the other dimension. And there is another dimension now that is has only become available because of the work of the OECD. And that's the dimension of equity. So we can also compare countries in terms of how equitable they are. And let me define here what the equity is. And I'm actually using the definition here that is coming directly from your Gonski review report that many of you may know. At least this is something that people are speaking about. And Gonski team was defining equity as the strength of relationship between children's family background and their performance in school, right? Because we know that children's family, in other words, their parents' education and wealth, is the strongest determinant of the child's learning and performance in a school, okay? So if the relationship is very strong, as it is in many countries, meaning that the children from poorer families have poorer educational results, then we say that the education system has a low equity, okay? And if this relationship is weak, in other words, that there are children who can perform and be successful regardless of their family background, we say that the system is equitable. And this is a very important way to look at this thing. So where is Australia? It's over there, and here are some other countries that you will see. I will say a few words about what this equity means in practice in a moment. But if you look at some of the OECD countries over there, you probably realize the interesting kind of a relationship between equity and excellence, right? And excellence means learning outcomes, and equity is the relationship between the family background and the student's performance. It kind of proposes that there must be some type of link between these things, because there are no countries with a high performance and high learning outcomes and low equity, or high equity and low learning outcomes. And this is the interesting thing. But where is Finland? Finland is not there, no? Here we are, okay? This is Finland in 1970, 40 years ago, when we had a school system where many of the grammar schools were privately run, and the school system was actually dividing people into two different societies. I was lucky one to go into grammar school, but many of my friends were not, okay? And this is where we were 40 years ago, and exactly 40 years ago, we started to change the system and design an education system that is primarily built on equity. And now if you look at the Finnish flag there, this is how the path of Finland has looked like during the last 30 or 40 years, all right? And the OECD is calling all these four countries now the high-performing education system. So there are Japan, Korea, Finland, and Canada. So the good news for your prime minister is that there's one place left there. You know, if you want to be among the 5 best, there's one seat available, but not too much. So the lesson from this evidence, and this is all based on the OECD data that anybody can read, is that if you want to improve the performance of your education system, in other words, if you want to go to the top 5, you cannot go there by only focusing on excellence and quality. You have to also do something with the issues related to equity. And some of those issues that are related to equity are examples like early childhood development. We have to have a systematic way of helping those who have more difficult life circumstances before they come to school. We have to have a specified program and strategy how to help those children when they come to school through special education and well-being and health services, just like Finland is doing. We have to have a funding system that is fair, just like the Konski review was recommending here, okay? And we also need to think about school choice, how much the parental choice has to do with this thing. I'm not saying that we have to abolish private schools, but I'm saying that we have to do something with this issue, not only here in Australia, but anywhere where the plan is to be on the top, okay? So if you look at the situation in 2003 in these 3 countries, so this is how things were about 10 years ago, the interesting question is that what has happened since in Finland, Australia, and New Zealand? And I keep the OECD average in one place. So if you look, the direction is a wrong way in all these countries, including Finland. In Finland, probably a little bit less than in Australia and New Zealand, but the OECD data shows that you are actually in the wrong way. You're going in the wrong direction. Your equity is going worse, and also your learning outcomes are a little bit worse than they used to be earlier on. So that's why this is a critical question also when this plan is considered. Let me tell you briefly about my niece, just a little story about Finnish teachers. She's my sister's daughter. Isn't she nice? Yeah. She's about 26, 27 years old here, and she's engaged. Yeah. So any in the audience who has some other thoughts, I have to disappoint you. Yeah. But when she graduated from high school, she was one of those what we call a straight A graduates. She was very good in all academic subjects and got the highest marks on everything. She was doing music and sports and everything that you can imagine a good, talented young person would do. In the spring, when she was graduating, she called me and said that, "Uncle, I have decided to become a primary school teacher. What should I do?" And I said that, "Vera, you are very good in everything. You do music and sports, and you master your academics. There's no worries, just go there and be yourself." 3 months later, she called me crying, saying that they didn't take me. So of course I wanted to know what was wrong with this case, and she said that everything else was easy. I passed the written exam, I passed the practice that they have to do to show how they can perform with other candidates in a team situation. And then she was sitting in front of the panel where the professors and lecturers are interviewing each and every candidate before they are accepted to a 5 or 6 year master's degree-based university academic program. And I said that what was the most difficult question that they asked you? And she said that maybe the question when they said, "Why did you come here?" Because with your diploma and your marks, your grades, you could have gone to law school or medicine or business or anything you like, but why do you want to become a teacher? And you know what she said? She said that my uncle is a teacher, and my mother is a teacher, and my grandfather, and there are many teachers in our family, like those of you who have teachers in the family knows that it's somehow running in the family, this thing, yeah? And that was a wrong answer. She was not able to convince the panel of her moral commitment to teach. Okay? So she asked me that what should I do, and I said, go and work in a school for a year, and if you still think that this is what you want to do, go back and they will take you. And this is exactly what happened, and now she graduated. And her letter is in my book, if you want to read what she wrote to me about why she wants to teach. And it shows you clearly that she went to teach because she wants to make difference in people's lives, and particularly those young peoples and children who have more difficult conditions than everybody else. Okay? Now, if you think that Vera was a kind of an exception, this is how the situation looked like in the entire country this spring. We had about 7,000 candidates. 7,000 young Finns wanted to become primary school teachers in our master's degree programs in 8 of our universities, and we only took 660. So it's about 10% possibility that you can get in. And most of those 660 students who will be future teachers in Finland are exactly like my niece. They are there because they want to make a difference in people's lives. And they want to work, like my niece, they want to work in the schools where children have more difficult circumstances than anywhere else. And this is a very important thing regarding teachers in Finland. Now, let me wind up and conclude what I want to tell you. Now, the OECD is coming with the kind of findings or conclusions related to school choice and private schools and equity in education. That is a very significant material. This is not my opinion. This comes from the OECD evidence. The OECD is saying that the school choice advocates often argue that the introduction of market mechanisms allows equal access to high quality schooling for all. This is a very common argument that you can hear here and in many other countries. However, evidence does not support these perceptions, as choice and associated market mechanisms can enhance segregation. This is OECD saying this, not me. Okay? And they continue by saying that the highest performing education systems across the OECD countries are those who combine quality with equity. Very important things. And finally, the OECD's conclusion is that we need to invest more heavily in schools in disadvantaged communities, which are overwhelmingly public schools. This is particularly true here, right? So, I have a question for you. Do you want to improve the education system here so that in the future your children will do a little bit better? Do you want to improve your system so that parents will have more choice for their children? Or that the government, the federal government, will have less control what is happening in the communities? If this is what you want, you are probably on the right way. But if you want to make Australia competitive with other nations, high-performing countries that you saw there, if you want that every single child here in all of the communities will learn better, and some of them much better than they do now, I don't think that you're going to get there, unless you seriously consider some of the things, some of the policies that are in place here and in many other countries. Australia is not alone with these things. 3 things I think are important when we think about the parental choice or private versus public education anywhere. So this is not necessarily just for you. The one thing I think is important to do in this, rather than saying that we need private schools or we don't need them, is the question, how do we better manage private schools or independent schools as part of the network? And there are many good examples around the world where this is done. For example, in Finland, we have a small number of private schools, but they are part of the public education system. They have to take the children from their communities, and they cannot not charge money for parents. And they have to show and prove that they have a kind of a social mix that they take into their classrooms. There are many other ways to manage better the private school, independent school thing. This is just one example. The other one is to give incentives for private schools to take in children who are not doing so well. Okay? So if there is a choice and if there's a selection into private schools or independent schools, there are many countries who are giving incentives to these schools so that if they have a certain number of children from lower classes or immigrant background or those who are not learning so well, they get financial incentives for this, but not automatically funding public school, private schools through public money. And finally, we need to inform those parents who probably otherwise wouldn't go to private schools more about the opportunities and how to enroll and have access to these schools if these two previous things are in place. So with this, I would like to just turn this question also a little bit other way around, that it's not about either or, it's what we can do and how we can manage and handle this thing. And this is a greeting from my son. You know, I have this lovely 5-month-old little boy, his name is Otto, and he wants to say hello to you from Finland. Yeah? And Otto is asking, if he could talk, he would probably ask that, Daddy, why do you travel around the world and not spend time with me? And my excuse, every night I go to sleep, I call him and I say, Otto, I want to save public education in the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Pasi. That was, okay, that's it. Thank you very much for coming. Oh, no, wait, I forgot. Now, look, I learned a lot there. I learned that I'm crap at maths, but so are you. I've learned that people love to take photos of graphs. Excellent, well done. And I also learned that after looking at that screen, me and all the other panel members are going to the physio tomorrow, all for neck problems. Now, what we want to do now, we want to bring out a line of sort of sad-looking children just to line up at the front, play some sentimental music and just stare at you to really frame the discussion. But since you've done that sort of with Otto, I think we've achieved that. So let me introduce our panel. Next to Pasi is Jennifer Buckingham. She's a research fellow at the Centre for Independent Studies. Her main area of work is school education. She's published on school funding, teacher training, class size, educational disadvantage, and written hundreds of newspaper articles about education. And like many, I think most of our panellists, she actually attended school, so she has that perspective as well. Next to her is Verity Firth. She is the CEO of the Public Education Foundation, a not-for-profit charity that provides scholarships to young people in public education. Previously, she was a Labor member for Balmain from 2007 to 2011. That is in the Yema, Rees, Keneally, and there might have been a few more governments. She became a minister on the day she was sworn into Parliament. She got about 5 portfolios before she even knew where the toilets were, so that's pretty impressive, and was Minister for Education and Training from 2009 to 2011. Jane Caro is a writer, lecturer, author and commentator who's done many things, but most relevantly for our purposes, written 2 books on education, The Stupid Country, How Australia is Dismantling Public Education, and What Makes a Good School. She's also a board member of the Public Education Foundation and many other things too. Next to her, brother David Hall has been, since 2010, principal of Roman Catholic Marist Brothers Boys High School with about 900 students, Marcelin College in Randwick. He's also chair of the board of St Joseph's in Hunters Hill and several other Marist Brothers School around New South Wales as well. And finally, we are joined by Topsfield, education editor of The Age. She's been a journalist since 2004 with The Age. She has been and is a respected and consistent reporter and commentator on education. Previously been a member of the Canberra Press Gallery, where she managed to do something that hardly any Canberra Press journalists have done. She left. So welcome them all. Welcome them all, please. Now, in Australia today, so much of the debate about education seems to be about the funding of public versus, there's always that word, private schools. Sometimes it seems to get in the way of consideration of other big issues, other big questions like what is the best way to teach and to learn? What do we want 13 years of schooling to actually achieve? And for God's sake, what is the point of trigonometry? So let's begin with this question. What would Australia look like if private schools were abolished? Let's not worry about the transition. Let's say that magically, let's assume that all private schools were replaced by adequately funded public schools. What would it be like, Jane?
Well, the way I define public and private, and I always use those two terms, is really about access. So the reason I call private schools is because when they charge fees, that is a way of restricting access. That is a way of, it's a sorting mechanism. Whereas public schools, as a system, have a legal obligation to provide a place for every single child in their own right as a citizen of Australia. That's what they're formed to do. So I'm not talking about whether if we were to abolish private schools, my view is we would be abolishing those schools that are able to deny access to various kids for all sorts of reasons. Because I think one of the things we've done with the current parental choice obsession is we've actually not really created all that much parental choice for most parents with any number of children over any long period of time. It's pretty hard to afford private school fees for 13 years for more than one kid for most families, even so-called low-fee schools. What we've actually done is we've created choice for some schools over which children they will and won't educate. And that's some public schools as well have developed that ability to select which kids they will take and which kids they won't take. And that's what happens when you make it a kind of popularity race as to which kids you can get into certain schools that become desirable, and everybody tends to choose the same schools, which is really difficult. So if we had a situation where there were no private access schools, so all schools were publicly accessible to everyone and no one could refuse to take a child, then I think what we would find is a great improvement in equity. We would also do something really, really vital, and this is what we're losing so much in Australia. We would get back our middle-class parents to be concerned about what happens to our public school system. Because what's happened now is we've not just lost their resources, we've lost their attitude towards education, their energy, their ability to negotiate their way through life relatively successfully.
So do you mean by that if parents see a problem, they don't try and fix it, they bail?
They bail. They see a problem, they bail. And what happens is the kids that get left behind, increasingly, and the statistics are in, there's no question about these statistics, what increasingly happens is the kids and the families with no choice get more and more concentrated in the same schools. And we know from research that has a compounding disadvantage effect on those kids in those schools. Their total performance begins to fall. And I think that may have a lot to do with that slow downward trend that's happening in the Australian system.
All right, Jennifer, what do you think an Australia without private schools would be like?
I think it'd be a bit dull. I obviously am keen on school choice. I like parents to be able to choose the school that they think is the best for their kid, and I like the variety of schools there are in Australia. I think we're assuming that that Australian schools are overall not all that good, whereas in reality the vast majority are very good and they're doing really well.
But we're not really talking about that. Aren't we talking about whether without private schools it would be better? Doesn't matter whether they're good now or bad now. Would it be better without them?
I don't think so, no. And I think when you look at, coming back to the PISA results, when you look at the results and you parcel them out in terms of different groups of students, what you find is that there is a small, not a small proportion, but a minority of schools which are doing really badly. In terms of PISA results, or a minority of students. 75% of kids are above OECD average, and most of them are way amongst the top performers when you look at the distribution of results. We've got about 25% of kids who are, unfortunately, those from the most socio-economically disadvantaged backgrounds who are performing much worse than everyone else. Abolishing private schools won't help those kids. Focusing on
Verity,
the schools that they're in will.
Do you agree with that? Abolishing private schools wouldn't help those kids?
No, I don't agree with that.
Look, I think you've shown your colours, all right?
I've just had a baby, so this is the first time I've done this for a while, so I've got my little crib notes so that I could get it right. But, for example, in Australia...
Actually, sorry, the baby's backstage crying.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I better go. 89% of students from the lowest SES quartile are below national average. 89%. And by year 9, the poorest quartile, the lowest SES quartile, is on average 3 years behind the wealthiest SES quartile. Now, everything you were saying Pasi is absolutely right. You actually can't achieve excellence. You actually can't achieve the sort of, even if you're totally capitalist about it, the sort of growth that you want your economy to achieve without actually providing equity in the system. We believe there are talented kids out there across the classes, across the races, across the genders, and it is our duty to make sure that they all have access to an education and a good education. And unfortunately, what all the research shows us is that where you compound disadvantage, and Australia, compared to other countries, compounds disadvantage in our schools more so than their equivalent OECD countries and way above OECD average, where you compound disadvantage all in one schools, even the bright working class kids in those schools don't do as well. They actually can't climb above compounded disadvantage. We need to make sure that we comprehensivise our system again.
And how is abolishing private schools going to do that? There are still going to be pockets of social disadvantage. That won't automatically make the schools in those areas better, will it?
Yes, that's right. And that then goes to Jane's argument about selectivity. Just abolishing private schools, to be honest, wouldn't be enough. You've actually got to make sure that there aren't some schools... So, all right. One of the research pieces that was written for Gonski was by the Nous Review, and what Nous argues is that once you take away SES, low SES, once you factor that in, most schools actually do pretty well on the actual teaching. So there isn't much difference between a government school and a non-government school on teaching students. Really the only difference is cohort of students. We can't have a system where some schools have the capacity just to say, well, we're not going to take those kids, that's too hard, and therefore another whole section of schools have to take them. I think as long as there's public funding, I think we should have stricter rules around public funding, and I'm happy to talk about Gonski in more length later. I think Gonski's going a long way, and I'm very, very pleased with Gonski. But I think we should even be harder line than Gonski. We should say where you receive public funding, a corollary of that is you have to have open access. If you receive public funds, then your school is open access.
Well, David, Brother David, I can call you Brother David. Look, they're talking about abolishing something you've spent your life working for. You're principal of a private school, Randwick Marsland, on the board of St Joey's and a number of others. You could still be in a comprehensive public school-funded system. You could still be a principal, and all the brothers who teach in your school could still be teachers. Could that be a better world, or tell me why it won't be?
Well, I think, James, if we abolished private schools, and Catholic schools in particular, we'd have a lot of crucifixes and statues to sell to start with. And maybe then we could give that to the public sector and we'd all be well off.
Yeah, that's right. A capital influx, yeah.
But I do think we have to be very careful to recognise that we don't homogenise schooling. And I do agree that we could end up with a very dull education system.
So when you say dull, one kid only goes to usually one school, or maybe two or three. Don't we kind of want them all to learn the same things, have a variety of things they can do within the school, but not be worried about whether you go to that school or that school, that'll be better, that'll be worse?
But the variety of across schools contributes to the tapestry of education. And if we can provide that for people, if we can provide people with choice, and when I'm talking about choice, I'm not saying that we don't fund public education well. I believe we should fund public education well. But we have to recognise that just by taking money away from private schools is going to make public education better. That just won't happen. We have to look at issues that are associated with how we teach kids and what sorts of kids get into all schools. Because we don't want to live in the myth that all public schools are equitable and that there's equitable access. If you live in a high socio-economic suburb, you go to the school in the area, and generally speaking, it does better. And so what we want to make sure that we do is that we fund the schools that have the need in the way in which they should be funded.
Needs-based funding. Probably a good oh, look, they were hooting, now they're cheering you. What an orator. A good time to get a comment from you, Jewel, on Gonski. I wonder if his ears burn every time the word Gonski is said. So say Australia's here and Finland is here, right? is Gonski taking us there, or there? How big a change would it be if fully implemented?
Sure. I mean, when the Gonski Review, when the panel was doing their research, they commissioned a lot of research, and it found that where Australia is still doing relatively well in the PISA, the International Test of 15-year-olds, that our performance has declined in recent times. And one of the things, I was lucky enough to interview Pasi on Tuesday, and he was saying that in Finland, when they have samples from different schools, that then the schools' results are very much the same. There's very little difference between the schools' results within Finland. And in Australia, that's not the case. The commissioned research was showing that schools that have families predominantly from wealthy families were, on the whole, on average, 2 years ahead of schools that mainly had kids from poorer families. And so David Gonski recognised that this was pivotal to improving outcomes. So the whole, if you like, the whole Gonski Review is based around equity and an improvement in equity. But I guess there's one caveat in that, and that because governments in Australia feel that any notion that funding be taken away from private schools is electoral kryptonite, if you like, then the caveat for the whole Gonski Review was that no school would lose a single dollar. So although it is a much more needs-based model, so basically they allocate an amount of funding per student, and then there are loadings for disability, low SES, indigeneity, which is a word I learnt since doing this. There is still the I guess the overriding caveat, and what Gillard said, that our Prime Minister said to Gonski, was that the report must show that all schools will actually, at the time, not lose a dollar, and now she's gone further and said all schools will increase funding. So while, yes, it is, certainly I think will bring us, it is a much more needs-based equity model, it does still see all schools increase in funding, and finding that money will be interesting, how they manage to do that.
Pasi.
Yeah, just a comment to a couple of my colleagues here. I don't think that Finland has a dull education system. I think we have a very... I think our school system is a very vibrant and very inspirational, because every single school and every single classroom reflects the community where they operate. And you could equally ask this question, that would private schools be good for Finland if we now allow private schools? And I think probably nothing much would happen. The quality would remain high, but we would, for sure, we would see very quickly, like Sweden has seen, segregation of education. That will be very difficult to manage and handle. And when we lose equity, as you saw in these images, when you lose equity, the maintaining quality, the high learning will become very, very difficult.
Jennifer, let's just tease out this justification, I guess, of private schools around the idea of choice. It's not only choice for all, is it? I mean, if you have a limited income, say you're a school teacher, then there is no... Is there a choice? And of course, it's not, you can't say, I mean, not you personally, but the justification can't be, well, if you'd worked hard, then you would have made enough money to have the choice, because it's not about the parents, really. It's about the outcomes for the kids, and it's not their fault.
Yeah, of course. And again, coming back to the Gonski Review, part of the proposal for funding was that there would be, at least in basis, an equal amount of funding going to both public and private schools based on the number of children there and the needs that they have. At the moment, that's not the case. If you're a non-government school of any description, automatically you receive less funding from government funding. That's a fact. I don't know what you're laughing at. It's indisputable. And the amounts of those vary. And so therefore, and I'm not saying that all non-government schools charge only what they have to charge in terms of fees in order to be able to operate, but all non-government schools have to charge fees of some kind in order to bring their level of funding up to an equivalent level of a public school. Some go beyond that. And I agree with Jane that there are some that they charge an amount of money that acts as a block to ordinary families to be able to choose those schools. So no, not every family can choose every school. But I do think that for most families, there is some choice, even if it's within the public schools in the area. That there's zoning is still alive and well in New South Wales, and you know, that does restrict choice. But I would like to see more.
And you think, don't you, that there should be more private investment in public schools?
Certainly.
How would that work? From parents, from McDonald's sponsorships?
So, there is so much potential for...
how?
Through philanthropy, that there are tax incentives for people to support non-government schools that are not there for people who support public schools.
Just let her talk.
These are facts.
Yeah,
I'm not quite sure. I'm not quite sure what so. I guess you've come with predisposed ideas.
No, but would you anticipate most of that private investment came from corporations or from parents or from where?
Well, from both. There are a lot of well-off families who choose to send their kids to public schools. That, again, is a fact. They're not expected to contribute above and beyond the level of their taxes. They get the full level of public funding for their students, and that's the way the system works. And the proposal that I made to the Gonski Review was that if you were going to take capacity to pay of a school's community into account, then that should apply to all schools.
Yeah, okay, Jane.
Not just private schools, but given also what Verity said, that there has to be some conditions around access, that if you have the full level of public funding, then there are some conditions and parameters around what the school can do.
Okay, Jane, tell us what you think happens to public funding that goes to schools like the one David is chair of, St Joseph's at Hunters Hill.
It's easy what happens.
What happens?
Basically, the problem is that the public subsidy of private supply is almost always inflationary. We've seen it in the childcare rebate, we see it in some of the medical, private health rebates. The first homeowners scheme is another example. Because market forces, and can I tell you, I've worked in advertising for 30 years. I am the high priestess of market forces, okay? Market forces work like this. The market will charge what the market will bear. So each school then looks at what they can get their parents to pay. And if that's $25,000 a year, that's what they're going to charge. And they'll take the subsidy and say, thank you very much, government, and they'll use it. And what we now have...
But they've got to be run as not-for-profit schools.
Yeah.
No, they do.
Yeah.
No, I mean, that's true, isn't it?
Yeah. But profit is a word that is used as an accounting term. Basically what we have now is a publicly subsidised arms race at the very top end, and I'm only talking about schools that probably educate 5% of Australia's kids in total. So largely they're to some extent irrelevant, but not entirely, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But they skew our funding system all the time because they insist on getting public money. And the problem is that they have now a publicly subsidised arms race where to get the kids to compete against one another, to get the kids of the parents who are prepared to pay $25,000 a year, they have to offer ever more luxurious facilities to win that competition. This is outrageous. It's a complete waste of money. It's a complete waste of the parents' money, who are silly enough to pay those fees.
But you're more concerned that you think it's a complete waste of the taxpayers' money.
Well, right. It's inflationary. It drives it up.
David, I mean, you're sitting there very calmly. Do you want to throw water over Jane, or what's your response?
The danger is to keep the conversation at the 5% high end. Because in Australia, the bulk of non-government schools are not the high end. If you take the school I run, at Marsland at Randwick, it costs $2,000 less to run than a state school. Per student, $2,000 less a year. That's the fact of the matter. Even though we charge fees, we get state and Commonwealth government funding, we charge fees, and we are still 10% behind. So we've got to make sure that when we have this debate in Australia, that we're not only debating about the high end, as important as it is to address that issue.
But you're part of the high end, so do you agree with what Jane said about that high end?
There is a degree to which, yes, people believe if you pay more, you get more. There is, and you also pay more and get less because you go to school less in those schools. But,
but does St Joey's need a bit of my taxes, or could it survive without it?
No, it couldn't survive without it.
Sure?
not to offer the level at which it's currently offering, but the other thing you've got to remember about that school is that that school is not only serving the high end, it's serving a rural population as well. We're talking about, in that particular school, a unique school of 900 students and 650 boarders.
But wouldn't that be high-end rural? And a few good rugby players?
Oh, well, we'd like a few of those. And then we then intentionally have to then say to ourselves, how can we then provide access to those that don't have access? And we have, controversial as it is, but in partnership with Indigenous communities, an intentional Indigenous education program, on the accusation that schools like that don't educate kids from those disadvantaged backgrounds. But
do you take the toughest ones? Do you take the most badly behaved? Do you take the poorest performing? Do you take the ones that fail the tests? Or do you take the kids
if
that
they're
do
good at
really,
rugby?
If they, yeah. Do you take the ones that do well? The best performers?
yes, we do.
Yeah, and you take the role models out of those schools and the kids that get left behind go into that compounding disadvantage.
No, those kids that come from... No, you're wrong. Those kids that come from those Indigenous communities are selected by the community. They're not selected by us. And that's a very important thing to remember.
What happens to the kids that get left behind?
We can only do
so
much in one... And remember, the Catholic system also operates many other schools that meet the needs of many other kids. And if we want... No, just wait a minute, Jane. Just wait a minute. If we want...
See why I put them next to each other?
If you want to talk about it this way, then you have to start talking about James Roos and Mount Druitt High in the same sentence.
I agree.
You have to do that.
Yes, and I will, and I'll say this. No school system anywhere in the world is completely equitable. Perfection is not achievable in human society, but just because you can't make it completely equitable and perfect doesn't mean it's okay to make it more wrong. That doesn't work. And that's what Australia's doing. We've decided, we can't make it equitable, let's make it even less equitable.
All right, let's we'll come back to you. Now, Pasi, let me get your comment on this. A couple of years ago, there seemed to be more measuring sort of standardised tests. Suddenly they were all on a website where it might even have been under your watch, was it? Where you could go and say, look, this school got 18 and this school got 26. And so you think 26 is more than 18, even though I'm crap at maths. So that's a better school. More transparency, more standardised. You don't do any of that in Finland. Are we going the wrong direction with all of that?
No, I wouldn't say so, but I must say that I don't have a full understanding of my school website stuff. But I went to see it because of this panel, and I took a hat of a child who is living in a family where the things are not going so well. And I must say that I struggle to understand what all this information is all about. So my point here is that information and data is, of course, is necessary and important. But I think what my school and other similar types of things are doing, that they are serving mostly those who are educated parents, who care about data and who want to use it. But what can those families or parents do who are not literate with this type of information? They are not really using this type of thing. But we don't have anything like this in Finland, no.
Verity, a big part of the Finnish success story seems to be investment in teachers, and that's in training, it's in lower contact hours per week, but it also seems to be in the fact that they feel valued. Sometimes in New South Wales there seems to be a degree of tension between government and teachers, where you might think that many teachers would feel not a great deal of love towards government. Are we guilty of that? And if so, what could be done to try and fix it?
I think some of the most interesting stuff that's been done in Finland is about how they value their teaching profession. I think that is really
more
interesting.
money shouted somewhere.
Yeah. And interestingly...
Well, sorry, just pause there.
Yeah.
Is that the solution? Pay them more money?
Not necessarily.
Are they
not
paid
necessarily.
Very high? Are they
just
paid
status.
much more highly in Finland?
No, but I think teachers have to be paid well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Again, crib notes. What's interesting about Australian teachers' wages in comparison to the OECD is that we start off higher. So our beginning wages are high for teachers. They climb very quickly to the top level. So within about 9 years, they're at the top level, though it takes 24 years for teachers in other jurisdictions to climb to the top level. But our top level wages are a lot lower. So our top level wages are 24% below OECD average. And it's not all about wages. What we've found when we've looked at other jurisdictions, it's also about status. So it's about higher marks to get in, it's about the master's degrees that the Finnish system requires, and it is about the relief time, particularly in the first 5 years of education. So especially in the first 5 years of education, I'll give you an anecdote to explain that. When I was Education Minister, I was up in Brewarrina and we were doing a tour of all the really quite tough but fascinating schools we run up in the state's northwest. And a lot of young teachers go there because that's the nature of the system. They're sent out to Brewarrina and to Burke and so forth. And they were amazing young people, full of idealism, full of hope. But everyone said to me, all we want is a bit more relief time because it's the first time we've been in the classroom. We just need our hand held a bit more. So when we got back to Sydney, we put together a package with the Aboriginal Education Consultative Group and we managed to get relief time and so forth. But where it always falls apart is money. Because in the government system in New South Wales, we have 100,000 employees. So even just a couple of hours of relief time can cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. So that's where Gonski's really interesting. That is really where the great, and bringing the federal government into school funding in a way that locks them in to a formula that actually says we are going to fund schools on the basis of need, and not only that, we're going to fund them on the concentration of disadvantage in those schools, is gold, because what we've got in Australia, and not to get too boring about it, is this ridiculous system where the state governments run all the services. We pay all the state schools. 90% of state schools, government schools, are funded by state governments, but we don't have income tax, and all the growth in income and all the ability to raise and pump money into this system is actually at the federal level. And until Gonski, federal government essentially funded private schools and state governments funded government schools.
And we're the third lowest funders of public education in the OECD and the third highest of private education.
Jennifer, a comment about teachers and the importance of, or unimportance of lowering their contact hours and raising their training, their status. What do you think?
I think, as well as Verity said, salary is important, particularly the potential to increase salary as you become more experienced and more adept is really important. But working conditions are so important as well. So many teachers, particularly in public schools, just don't have their own workspace. I don't know how any professional can work like that. So there are a whole lot of things around pay and conditions for teachers that we could do a lot better, and including teacher training.
David, have you had schools that have come to your schools from the public system? And if so, how would you compare the conditions of that your teachers operate under to them?
I would say our conditions are very similar, where we have equal pay, for example, and we have a commitment, at least in the Catholic sector, not to step itself ahead of the state sector. But the thing that is missing in the conversation about achieving excellence is what happens in that room between those kids and that teacher and those kids. And what that environment is like has a lot to do with whether we'll achieve excellence or not. And as far as I'm concerned, our teachers work too hard. We require them to be face-to-face too much. The mounting pressures are considerable. The accountabilities are becoming very difficult to manage. And so you're getting a population of people who, while society doesn't see it, because we get our 10, 12, wherever, or 15 in an independent school, but like you get all these holidays. But the tension in a school is extraordinary. And I think we have to do something.
Well, more than it was 10 years ago.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Even in the private system, obviously.
Definitely. The accountabilities are higher across the whole sector, and the expectations of what schools will achieve. Because just one other thing, those that are making these rules about benchmarking and measuring have no idea what it means to educate a kid and to create an environment in which education will happen well.
Now,
no idea.
Wait. Would one of those people, I suppose by implication, be the lady on my left?
Well, she's not minister at the present time.
No, but she was.
Mind you, it'd be good if you were, because the current one's not doing a very good job, at least in relation to funding. But, yeah, anyway.
Joel, is Gonski going to change any of that? Is Gonski going to make conditions for teachers more like the things we've just talked about?
One of the things that that Gillard has done, or the Prime Minister has done, has linked the reforms in funding to what's called the National School Improvement Plan. And in that, she talks a lot about the need for things like improved teacher training, teachers who are at university doing at least a term in the classroom before they graduate, doing bullying programs and discipline programs. So on the face of it, yes, although I thought that some of the things that she said, she said things like, we want, you have to be top of the class to get into teaching. And I thought, as we all know, university degrees are largely based on demand for courses. And I think until we start paying teachers better and doing, as in Finland, where, there's the prestige of the profession is akin to medicine and law. And until I think it's I don't think we can just arbitrarily say, you have to be top of the class to get into teaching, because who would do it at the moment? So, there are certainly reforms that are linked, but I guess one of the things that constantly sort of strikes me about the political debate around teacher reform, and I have to declare my bias here because both of my parents were teachers, but the punitive language that's used in the discourse around teaching constantly surprises me. I think that to learn to read is probably one of the greatest gifts that you can confer upon a child. And I think there's this complete disconnect in our society between the status of teaching as a profession and the incredibly and acknowledged value of a great teacher, how transformative that can be in a kid's life.
Pasi, am I right in thinking that in any given year, about a third of Finnish children receive some form of special or extra assistance?
That's correct.
So that's far higher than here, I would imagine. Does that mean that every time someone seems to be struggling in a particular subject, maths or history, there is a great awareness of that and resources to help?
Yeah, there are two things. One is that we have probably a little bit different definition for special needs children in our country than in many other countries, mostly referring to learning difficulties and such things that you can do. And the other one is that we also have a very systematic way of intervening early as possible, and that's why we have, particularly in the lower elementary grades, a lot of children who are somehow taking part in these remedial or special education things. And interestingly, if you look at the proportion of Finnish pupils in special education, as we define it in Finland, it's declining during the course of when they get older. Whereas in many other countries, the trend is other way around, when the problems get more and more serious, and then you end up having more and more children like this.
Yeah. We've got a few minutes left, and in that, before I ask you about one idea you think is important that you'd like to see happen in the next couple of years, let's get a bit philosophical and ask this question. What is education for? What do we really want those 13 years to achieve? Do we want everyone to have equal opportunity? Do we want everyone to come out having mastered 11 different skills? What do you think, David?
I think education is about citizenship. I think it's about educating young men and women who, according to their abilities, can make a contribution to society and be good partners and husbands and wives and lovers and friends and parents. So it's an exercise in citizenship. There's some skilling to be done in that as well.
And yet so often we boil it down to how good is someone at maths, don't we? And we forget about that.
And some of that's important. And we've got to remember too, when we look at all of this OEC...
Except the trigonometry bit.
Well, I failed that, 37% in maths. But when we look at this OECD data, we've got to remember that we're looking at effectiveness on the basis of numeracy, literacy and science. That's it. Education is more than that. And you want a kid that walks out of a school graduating confident that he or she can contribute and can build up society for themselves and for the common good.
Yeah, and that's what, parents look at all these websites and but when they go and look at a school, they come out and what they really feel is that had a nice vibe. Jane, what's education for?
I agree that it's a lot to do with citizenship.
Wasn't that lovely? You two come together.
And also that, of course, one of the really dangerous ideas the world has ever had is universal, secular, compulsory education for all, because that began the journey to democracy, because if you're going to have voters, you need to have people who are educated to exercise their vote. But I also think that one of the really important things that a schooling system gives kids is a place where they can actually get away from their bloody parents and learn about their peers and learn who they are as a separate individual.
I thought that was what Westfield was for.
Yeah, Westfield helps. Don't knock Westfield, good place. My kids spend a lot of time at Westfield. I think that it's all about, I really do think if you're looking at what will get you through life well in the end, it's not whether you do really well in maths. I failed maths too, and you and I are doing all right. Or anything else.
We should redo our panel. I did quite well, actually.
I think it's actually what gets you through life, social skills. The ability to get on with other people. And I think what mixing in a big, comprehensive school with lots of kids from lots of different places, with lots of different attitudes, with lots of different families showing lots of different ways to live lives, is you really develop your social skills. And that, to me, is the most precious thing we can help our kids to gain in our schooling system.
And that's why I sat you next to David.
Yeah, I don't mind. I'm very happy to sit next to David. We disagree respectfully.
Jennifer, what's education for?
Quality of life and opportunity, so that when children or students get through their however many years of schooling they put in, that they feel as though they have the opportunity and the ability to take whichever path is the right path for them, and to go into whatever endeavour they choose that makes them happy. And quality of life encompasses, I think, all of those things.
Verity?
I agree very much with Jane's vision, and I think one of the reasons why I sent my, ideologically committed of course, but I sent my daughter of course to our local public school, and what I love about it is that it's 30% Indigenous kids, Vietnamese kids, Arab kids, Islander kids, Anglo-Saxon kids, and they're all together and they're all mixing and they're all getting along, and I think, wow, what a gift to give her, you know. And the second thing I think, is about a love of learning. To me, and that's where a bit those standardised tests and things come in. I'm not against assessment for learning or assessment so we can see where people are up to, but most of all I want my daughter to be instilled with a love of learning. It's enjoyable and that she'll want to learn for the rest of her life.
Jill?
I think I agree very much with Verity. I think it's about kind of fostering curiosity, and if you can light that kind of flame of interest and wanting to go on for lifelong learning, then that's, I think, the ideal education system.
Now, I'm going to tell you what you think it is. I'm going to quote to you what you think the education system is for. I think it's lovely. To create a community of learners that provides the conditions that allow young people to discover their talent.
Where did you get that one?
Just seemed like something you might say.
This is exactly what I was supposed to say. Yeah?
Do you want to add to that? Or
No, I fully agree. I think, I fully agree what I said, If I will be successful in saving public education on this planet, I would hope that we have more schools where young people will discover who they are and find their talents, okay? So it's a very individualistic and personal goal, but exactly what you said. Well done, yeah?
If you can't think of anything clever, say something that someone else said that was clever. Now, let's end with one big idea that you think you'd like to happen in the Australian school system over the next couple of years. It can be something that might actually happen, or it can be a big dream that is unlikely to happen. Jill?
Someone sent me a tweet the other day and it said, "You're not going to stay in the education round very long." And I thought, here we go, but I kind of dutifully tweeted back, why not? And they said, because you actually, for someone in the media, seem to respect teachers. And I guess that would be my ardent hope that that teaching is elevated. And it's as much a sort of philosophical thing as any other reform, but it's actually acknowledged in our society, the pivotal role that teaching is, and that it's given the prestige, I guess, that it deserves.
And one practical thing we can do to help that come about?
Stop the teacher bashing.
David.
Mine is a very pragmatic thing, James, and it's around funding. That we are yet to give education the slice of the budget it requires. Gonski's just told us $5 billion extra a year to get it to where we need it. The state government's just cut it. And my dream is that we might get our fair slice of the education budget so that we can actually imagine the way the Finns imagine, that you can have schools that are beautiful places to work in, where teachers have and other staff in schools have appropriate workloads, and you get an harmonious environment that allows people to work together in an environment that fosters learning.
And one other thing they do in Finland, don't they? When they design, this is really interesting in the light of the school halls thing, when they design new buildings for schools, the architects come in and collaborate and discuss with the teachers what sort of buildings would be good for them that could enhance learning, right?
Right, correct.
It's not just, there it is. Jane.
I was at a conference a couple of years ago and a young teacher got up and said, I believe that public education is the promise one generation makes to the next.
Nice.
Which I thought was a really powerful statement. And so my vision is that Australia does not give up on the incredible, vital, fundamental importance of a well-funded, well-resourced, well-supported, high-standard, high equity, high excellent public school system that is open to all kids, and that we work hardest and we put the most amount of our effort, energy and concern and money to those children who need it the most. And we stop overfunding kids who really don't need any bloody more.
Verity.
It's a bit hard coming forth since I would have said teaching, funding and support for public education. But I'll give you just one little, so all of them, and I'll give you just one little anecdote, which is, I think as soon as you become a parent in the public school system, so I've become a parent, she's in kindergarten, you do suddenly realise what an amazing job teachers do. And I mean, you know it hypothetically before, but when you actually see it. And we had our education week, and so we went in so you watch the teacher teaching, and they were doing calendars, and it was Friday afternoon, and the kids were just, it was like herding cats. They were just literally running around the class, and the teacher was being really good, sort of herding them all back together. And one little boy
the
just...
parents were watching it.
Yeah, one little boy just fell on his back and kicked his legs and said, I can't spell Thursday. And I just thought, that's the work that the teachers do. And he brought him up, brought him back in the class, and I thought, that's amazing. When you leave your child at the school gate, it's one of the biggest acts of trust you ever do in your life. And they live up to it. They're just amazing. So I agree with what you've said. We've got to value teachers and treat them with the professional respect that they deserve.
Jennifer.
To add to all of that, just to nail my colours to the mast, I'm also a parent of children in public schools, and it's again, a wonderful public school in a very, very low SES area, and it meets enormous challenges every day. And I see what the teachers there do. One thing I really like about the Finnish system is their approach to special education. We have a lot more children in particularly public schools, but also some in Catholic schools and independent schools who need someone to recognise the difficulties early. The longer you allow those kids to struggle, the harder it is. So I'd love to see more early focus.
And Pasi, because you won them.
Yeah.
Because you've come so far, you're allowed to give us 3 ideas to think about on the way home.
First, I would introduce cross-country skiing as a compulsory part of our schools. Then I would build sauna in every single school building. And thirdly, I would probably try to use the diversity and excellence that you have in your non-governmental and Catholic schools and public schools to enhance the equity in the school system, because you can do that without abolishing and closing private schools. That's doable, but it requires a kind of a smart management.
Ladies and gentlemen, now when we finish, hang on, because when we finish, we'll just finish, so I've got to tell you this beforehand. On your way out, you get a free coffee cup, but it's empty. But It will be filled for free downstairs in the Reaction Lounge if you want to go there, courtesy of the Sydney Morning Herald. And some of our speakers will be downstairs doing a book signing, including Pasi, whose book I read in preparation for this. And it's fascinating if you're interested to find out more about the Finnish system. Please thank all our panellists, and please special thanks for Pasi. And now, we could either all look awkwardly or...